What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen, and we are taking a journey today. This is going to be one of potentially two, if not three parts, a deep dive into the Starved Rock murders, a triple homicide that occurred all the way back in 1960 in LaSalle, Illinois. There were three women hoping to enjoy a winter vacation that mysteriously went missing from the Starved Rock Lodge just hours after arriving, and their beaten, bloodied bodies were recovered days later at the mouth of a cave in Starved Rock Park, all face up, lined perfectly in a row as if they had been put on display. This crime swallowed the community whole. Hell, it swallowed me whole. The moment I started researching this, I was stuck in this black hole of trying to puzzle the pieces together, go through 60 plus years of news articles and podcasts and documentaries. There's so much information out there. No one understood who on earth could be capable of committing such a crime. So it was a huge shock when the dishwasher at the lodge of all people, 21-year-old Chester Weger, confessed months after the crime. 21-year-old kid, just over 100 pounds, somehow subdued three women and murdered them without a weapon. And despite his confession and ultimately his conviction, the entire 60 plus years he was in prison, he has maintained his innocence. He was actually just paroled back in 2020 at 80 something years old and is now diligently working beside his attorney Andy Hale to try to have his conviction vacated. In search for the truth, there's kind of been this can of worms that has been opened because there's been many questionable investigative tactics that have been brought forward, questionable evidence, potential other suspects that should have been looked at closer. Obviously, very difficult emotions for all, but what's even more difficult is the fact that we're also looking at a case that occurred decades ago where standards were very different. It seems there's still a very clear line between those that wholeheartedly believe Chester Weger is responsible and those that believe that the real murderer actually got away with it. But before we get into the details, I first want to say a huge thank you to Native for partnering with me on today's video. I've always been a fan of Native. I've spoken about them for years. I usually am absolutely raving about their deodorants. It's the only kind that I use. When it comes to self-care, I'm always looking for clean and simple ingredients, and Native Body Wash checks every single one of those boxes. It's vegan, cruelty-free, phthalate-free, dye-free. They even have a guide on the back, which is really awesome, explaining what each ingredient is and its purpose. It leaves my skin feeling so soft and hydrated. The lather is so luxurious and amazing, and most of the time, this is what I'm adding to my bubble baths. You get sane bubbles and your entire bathroom smells so good. There's a wide range of scents that you can choose from, and they're constantly releasing new scents. This one right here is my tried and true. It's a coconut and vanilla. If you know anything about me, you know that I love the beach, and this is essentially a beach in a bottle. I also decided to try out this scent. It's sea salt and cedar. I've had this in the deodorant, but I've never had this in the body wash, and it smells so good and it lingers on your skin for so long. I decided with summer coming, I would try the sweet peach and nectar, and you guys, I'm so glad that I branched out because oh, it smells so good. It's such a perfectly balanced scent, and it's not too sweet for me, but if you are someone that absolutely loves sweet scents, Native actually has a candy shop collection right now with scents like sour berry belts, which are some of my favorite candies, sweet cinnamon hearts, and my personal favorite, which is gummy bears. I don't have it in the body wash, but I do have it in the deodorant, and you guys, oh, Native has so much to offer, and it covers all of your personal care needs. So make the switch to something clean, simple products that are affordable, smell amazing, and keep you feeling incredibly fresh. You can use my link and code Danielle3 to get 20% off your first purchase at Native. This offer is available site-wide, so go on and have at it, but it is only for a limited time. So go ahead and stock up and save, and let me know what products you get and the scents that you choose. Thank you again to Native for partnering with me on today's video. It is brands like Native that allow me to do what I do and contribute back to families and organizations that I support as much as possible. And now on to the details of today's case. This case takes us back to 1960 in LaSalle, Illinois. Now LaSalle sits in this little cluster just southwest of Chicago. It's nestled in the middle of miles and miles and miles and miles of farmland, and it kind of thrives being beside the Illinois River. And while the town itself is quaint, it's a cute little area, there's definitely one main reason that a lot of people go to visit. On the southeastern outskirts of the town, right along that river, is the Starved Rock State Park. Now, I could probably make an entire video on this park alone. It is absolutely filled with Native American history and legends such as Lover's Leap. There's a legend that speaks about how the park actually got its name, which I'm sure you can use your imagination to get to that, but it's also an absolutely beautiful, beautiful location to explore. The park is filled with numerous trail systems things that let you enjoy the multiple different overlooks. There's also 18 canyons within the park that were formed by glacial meltwater, which is pretty awesome. And because of this, there are these beautiful rock formations and just rock walls that go up 150 plus feet in the air. And during the winter, the park is known for something especially beautiful, which is frozen waterfalls, particularly the one in St. Louis Canyon. So you can understand why a lot of people would gravitate towards this park and why it ended up being the destination for a winter trip that ultimately turned into a triple homicide. 50-year-old Lillian Oding, 50-year-old Mildred Lindquist, and 47-year-old Frances Murphy were all very prominent women living in the suburban Riverside area just outside of Chicago, Illinois. They were all best friends, living not even 5 minutes apart from each other. Husbands were well-known corporate businessmen, and the women themselves were also incredibly active, not just within their families, but within the communities. Lillian Oding was married to George Oding, and together they had 3 beautiful children, and unfortunately, there's just not a lot of information out there about these women because of how long ago it was, and a lot of their distant relatives never had the opportunity to meet them and get to know them. But what I did find was a statement from her mother saying, quote, "She was one of the kindest, most compassionate persons I've ever known." Mildred Lindquist was married to Robert, and together they had 2 children. And Miss Lindquist was also just as active in her children's lives, and she actually spent a lot of time on the school board. And those that knew her said, quote, "She had a marvelous personality. She always had a smile." And finally, Frances Murphy. Frances was married to Robert Murphy, and together they had 4 children. And a woman after my own heart, she was an avid gardener. She loved particularly to grow roses. She filled her home garden with roses. She would often work in the community gardens, and like the other women, she was a part of the school board. All 3 women were also very religious. They attended Riverside Presbyterian Church together. Now, being such busy women, as you can see, they decided, you know what, we're getting towards the end of winter. They wanted a nice 4-day getaway vacation away from all of their homely tasks. So after weeks of planning, they decided that they were going to visit Starved Rock Lodge in mid-March. They had plans to do some of the lighter hiking trails since one of them did struggle with their back. They wanted to see the canyons and the overlooks, take photographs, take some time to actually sit down and read and play cards and relax for a bit. So on Monday, March 14th, 1960, at around 10 a.m., all 3 women piled their bags into Miss Oding's station wagon and headed off for the park. According to an article by the Chicago Tribune, the women arrived at the lodge at around 12:20 p.m. They checked in, the bellhop showed them to their rooms, room 109 and room 110. And from there, they freshened up a little bit, threw their luggage inside, picked up their lunch vouchers from the front receptionist area, grabbed a bite to eat, and presumably went off on a midday hike sometime around 1 p.m. But the 3 women never returned back to the lodge, and somehow nobody noticed, so it took 2 days for anyone to search for them. According to reports, the night of the 14th, some of the husbands began to call into the lodge. They had all expected phone calls from their wives just to confirm their safe travels, and when those calls never came in, they wanted to just, take some initiative, call them themselves, but all of these calls went unanswered and unreturned. But at this point, these are grown women, they can take care of themselves, so there wasn't a whole lot of concern. These calls continued the following day, Tuesday the 15th, to no avail, and it wasn't until the early morning hours of Wednesday the 16th that one of these calls led to the staff checking on the women. Mr. Murphy had called into the lodge at around 7 to 7:30 a.m. saying, "Look, I want someone to go and check on all 3 women." At this point, it was strange that they had not reached out to their husbands, not returned any of the worried phone calls, and on top of that, the night prior, there had been a massive snowstorm that dumped over a foot of snow in the area. The snow drifts, I believe, even got up to like 25 feet. So worried about them in their drive the next day and the fact that they had no communication with them whatsoever, Terry Martin, a custodian at the lodge, was like, "Okay, I will personally go and check on the women." But seeing as the women would have been staying at the lodge at this point for 2 nights, the state the room was in raised every possible red flag. According to Terry Martin, there was absolutely no sign that the women had even been using either of the rooms. The beds had not been slept in. Their luggage was still just kind of tossed into the room and left there. It was not opened. There were no piles of dirty laundry. There was absolutely nothing. And when he looked, the only thing really missing were the women's hiking clothes that they had brought with them and their overshoes. So again, this kind of supported the idea that these women had gone for a walk Monday afternoon after arriving and never come back. However, they didn't want to jump to any rash conclusions right away. So Terry Martin was like, you know what? I'm going to go out to the parking lot and check for their car. But when he walked out there, he saw the station wagon completely untouched, exactly where the women had originally parked it, covered in a fresh layer of snow. At this point, fear rippled through everyone at the lodge and the families of the missing women. It was about 8:20 a.m. when Terry Martin made the call to the sheriff's department as the women's husbands were all being notified that no one could find them and were making their trip down to the lodge to help look for them. And after authorities had been called, Terry Martin and a handful of other employees went ahead and started to make plans to search the surrounding areas, bring in as many eyes as possible. Now, Sheriff Utzi arrived at the lodge at around 9:15, so about 45 minutes after he was called, and immediately he began to question all of the guests that were in the dining room, seeing if anyone by chance had seen the women, seen where they had gone. The same question was asked of the staff, and it became very clear that no one had seen the women since Monday mid-afternoon. Other employees began to very hopefully call around to other locations, checking other hotels, again, just to make sure they didn't go somewhere else, and then also making the dreaded calls to local hospitals to see if potentially something had happened to the women. While this park was well loved and it was beautiful, it was treacherous. So had the women gone out there and taken on a trail that maybe was too difficult, something could have gone very wrong. But all of this was to no avail. The women were not in any nearby hotels or any nearby hospitals. Now, at this point, while the sheriff is kind of questioning everybody, the family is still on the way, people are still being gathered, Terry Martin and a couple of other searchers decide to go ahead and check out a few of the very popular areas, starting at the French Canyon. And this is on the east side of the park, but they weren't finding anything. Now, at this point, other employees, as I stated, were trying to find other people to get boots on the ground. So they were calling the Boy Scouts, trying to get a couple of them to come down, the Illinois Youth Commission camp, because there was no telling if these women were out there clinging to life in this absolutely massive state park somewhere. Henry Wolford was one of the very first to arrive to help in the searches, and he was an employee at the nearby Illinois Youth Commission camp. At around 11 a.m., he had arrived with 5 of the young men from the camp at the park and immediately was greeted by Terry Martin. Henry Wolford had just lived in the area for a very long time, so he was familiar with all the trails and things. And also, when it comes to this camp, it was actually their job to maintain the park while the park was being rehabilitated. So over the entire time that these young men had been there, they had been working on the trails, they had been cleaning up trash, so they were familiar with the area as well. So Terry Martin told them all to head off to St. Louis Canyon first, as this was another very popular spot to visit during the winter, and then work their way back from there using the Bluff Trail. Henry Wolford and these 5 boys slowly made their way towards the canyon, along the way checking for any signs of the women. And they arrived at St. Louis Canyon at about 12:30 p.m. St. Louis Canyon is what is called a box canyon. So it's literally this 150-foot hole, essentially, and there's one way in and one way out, and you're just surrounded by these towering walls otherwise. And towards the back of the canyon are these eerie caves that have just been, again, carved out by this glacial meltwater that just go like 15 plus feet deep into the walls of the canyon. In the back of the canyon, in one of these caves that sat about 5 feet off the ground, they spotted the horribly beaten bodies of the 3 women, all face up, all in a row at the mouth of the cave. Right away, help was called, and when authorities arrived on the scene, the extent of the attack became overwhelmingly clear. 2 of the women had been placed side by side to the point that they were touching, and the third was about 4 feet away by herself. And the women were surrounded by things that confirmed they had been attempting to enjoy a mid-afternoon walk that had been savagely interrupted. There was a bent camera sitting beside the women, a pair of binoculars that they likely had used to try to do some bird watching that was split into two separate pieces, and both of these items were coated in blood. Both of these items likely had been used by the women in an attempt to hold off the attacker or the attackers. One of the women had a glove ripped off of her hand, one of their jackets was just haphazardly thrown to the side, and a pair of their glasses broken and covered in blood in the snow. A quick glance also showed a possible location just outside of the cave that the murders had likely occurred, and then drag marks made it clear that afterwards someone managed to move all three bodies up this 5-foot ledge into the cave, more than likely to conceal them. There were also footprints that could just barely be seen around the mouth of the cave underneath the freshly fallen snow that didn't seem to match the shoes of any of the women. This supported the presence of at least one attacker. The women themselves were all in a line, nude from the waist down. I do believe one of them did have a girdle on, but all of them had their skirts pulled up clear over their heads. This made it seem like the motive for this crime was sexual assault, but the savage way that they had been beaten, the women had all been so horribly beaten all over their faces, to the point that they were nearly decapitated and they were all unrecognizable. And this made it seem like there was some level of extreme rage behind whoever had committed this murder. On top of that, Miss Murphy was clear missing the tip of one of her fingers. It appeared to have been cut off and was absolutely nowhere to be found. And even more disturbing, 6 feet away from the cave, authorities found the potential murder weapon. A tree branch, a frozen tree branch that had likely been used as a club, about 3 feet long, 4 inches in diameter, and 10 pounds. Someone seemingly took advantage of a situation, found a weapon lying on the ground of the canyon, and so horrifically murdered these women. Now, it was initially theorized by the state's attorney Harlan Warren and Sheriff Ray Utsi that this had to have been the work of more than one person. When you look at the scene of the crime, the brutality of it, the fact that it's 3 women, it's not just a single homicide, and they very obviously fought back, it was believed it would have taken multiple attackers to subdue them. So the entire crime scene was roped off and an investigation began. And after photographs and things of that sort were all dealt with, the women were then whisked off to a funeral home for autopsies. On arrival, the pathologist immediately noticed a few things that gave more details to the crime and what could have potentially happened that day. Miss Oding and Miss Murphy had strands of either very thick twine or rope around their wrists, which indicated that they had been tied up at some point. But not just that, it appeared as if the women had potentially been tied together. They supported this by the fact that the women had been directly side by side touching when they were found in the cave, and also it appeared that there were 2 cut marks on the twine. One of the marks, it was very obvious that someone had separated the women with a knife, and the other one, it appeared as if someone had sawed at the twine a little bit and then eventually pulled it apart. And this brought up a lot of questions. First and foremost, there was potentially a knife involved. However, there were no signs as of this point that a knife had ever been used on the women. So did one person have a knife and was just watching, and someone else had this tree limb, which supports the idea that more than one person was responsible in there. But at the same time, some of this made authorities theorize that this could have potentially been done by just one person. Harlan Warren and Sheriff Utsi began to wonder if the women had kind of been backed into the canyon by one person. With these towering walls, there was no way for them to escape. That one person could have potentially then tied all 3 of the women together and then cut one of them off at a time to sexually assault them and then murder them. So while all of this extra information is good, it didn't really clear a lot of things up. And still, who on earth would do any of this? Almost immediately, suspicion ended up falling on the youth commission camp. These were troubled kids, around 16 to 19 years old. Right away, Stan Potter, who was the director of the camp, stepped up and made it very clear that this was not very likely. There were 36 boys at the camp during this time, and typically they were split up into a group of 5 or 6 boys. to one supervisor. And they were not allowed to just wander the park wherever they wanted to go. They couldn't go off by themselves. When they were in the park, they were always within eyeshot of the supervisor. And not just that, according to Stan Potter, they hadn't even worked in the park since December. And this camp was 20 miles away. So unless one of the boys or a group of them somehow managed to sneak out of the camp, make it 20 miles away without a car, murder the woman, and then come back, all while not being noticed by staff that claimed to check the boys every 20 or 30 minutes, it just didn't seem likely. So all of the boys were in fact questioned by authorities, but once it was mostly ruled out, they decided to focus their efforts towards other theories. And one of the biggest questions that they had is, how on earth did these women become targets? There was no direct trail leading from the lodge all the way to St. Louis Canyon. So it wasn't as easy as saying, okay, the women arrived at the lodge and then someone saw them there and then tracked them through these private trails and woods all the way to the canyon. Instead, the way the women would have had to take to get to the canyon would have taken them down south from the lodge and up Highway 178, meaning that anyone driving on the highway that day could have seen them and they could have become a target. And while there was always this chance that there was just some crazed killer wandering around the woods and the trails, it seemed a lot more likely someone had been following them. And at this point in time, authorities were even releasing to the media that they had clear evidence that this actually had happened. While they definitely wanted to check out everyone that had been on the highway that day, authorities figured the easiest and fastest place to start was obviously the lodge. 26 visitors had been staying at the lodge Monday the 14th, and there were also a total of 46 employees working there that day, with a complete total of 62 employees working at the lodge. So they had full intentions of questioning every single one of the different visitors. I believe there were a handful of couples, but there were also people that had been there on their own, and they also planned on questioning all of the different employees that were there. But again, because there was this possibility that someone maybe followed them from the highway or had been parked at the west entrance of the park where they would have entered to go into the canyon, they also announced that they were going to be checking all 17 local motels in the area to see if there had been any strange guests. And because it was believed at this point in time that the motive behind this murder was sexual assault, they also announced that they were going to check every single sex offender in LaSalle County. So they're already off to a rampaging start to try to figure out who is responsible for this crime. Meanwhile, family members and friends of these women had frantically come to the area to help with the searches, and instead were faced with an absolutely massive loss. Mr. Lindquist had been so upset and worked up when he heard that his wife could not be found that he actually left his home to come and look for her, leaving his front door of his home wide open. And honestly, thank goodness for good people and good communities, because people noticed it and immediately called the police department, and they came and closed his door and locked everything up so that would not have to be anything on his mind while all of this was going on. These people were experiencing losses of mothers, wives, sisters, best friends, grandmothers. All three women together left behind 9 children. So out of desperation to find the attacker, to make sure that this person or people did not do this to anyone else, and to get some justice for these women, a $30,000 reward was immediately put up for information leading to an arrest. Meanwhile, authorities just continued pushing forward. After a lengthy autopsy, even more heartbreaking information about the murders came to light. The women had clearly been killed by the repeated blows to the head that they received. The damage was to the extent that 2 of the women, their skulls were almost entirely crushed. There were no gunshot wounds. There was no evidence that they had been stabbed at any point, despite the fact that it was believed that a knife possibly separated their bindings. And this information, along with fragments of wood that were found embedded in Miss Oding's skull, supported the idea that this club that they had found was likely, in fact, the murder weapon. While the cave had also shown evidence already that these women had fought back, wounds on the women's bodies confirmed that there was a violent struggle in this cave. These women fought so hard for their lives. So fingernail scrapings were taken in case they had managed to get anything off their attacker. At this point, despite the numerous articles kind of stating it as fact, there was no confirmation of sexual assault on any of the women. Now, Miss Murphy did have some bruising in her vaginal area, but there was no semen found, and there were also no other injuries consistent with sexual assault that had been found. It was announced that a continued examination was expected to be able to say for sure. But one of the most promising pieces of evidence came directly from the struggle, from the fight that these women had put up against their attackers. Both Miss Oding and Miss Murphy had hair in their hands. Miss Oding actually had like a whole handful of hair. So this hair was immediately sent off for testing at the state lab to see if, again, it could potentially lead to any answers, along with the wood that had been found embedded in Miss Oding's skull. But until those results came back, which was going to take a while, efforts still pushed on. Authorities continued to search for evidence at the scene of the crime, and one of the first things they were really relying on was kind of a shot in the dark, but everyone had their fingers crossed. And that was that somehow these women managed to capture a photograph of their attacker through their camera. So the photos were sent off to be developed, and meanwhile, authorities were trying to come up with some way to get to the bottom of the canyon, to get underneath all of this snow that had fallen. They came up with the idea of bringing in flamethrowers. So they ended up setting up a little area right outside of the mouth of the cave and began to try to melt the snow down. And after a couple of hours of this, it actually surprisingly did not go as well as they thought it would. So they said, you know what, never mind, scrap this. We're going to instead just bring out shovels and sifters and go through the snow this way. And that did seem to move a little faster, but they still just weren't finding anything. While that search was ongoing, authorities also began to focus on questioning more people. So they set up roadblocks all along Highway 178 and nearby 71 to stop every single car passing through. If someone was routinely using these highways, there was a huge chance they were harboring information and had absolutely no idea. It was possible that they had seen the women walking to the west entrance of the park. Maybe they saw someone following them. Maybe they saw a group of people standing outside and could help give descriptions of them, or potentially they saw cars parked in the parking lot. So they stopped everyone that was coming through the area to see if they had any information. And not just that, they were also actually looking for the killer. It is not uncommon for those responsible of a murder to come back to the scene of the crime, whether it's to just relive that moment in some sick way or just to see what authorities are doing, see what's going on, how they're progressing. And so authorities were keeping their eye out for cars with 2 or more men inside, and they were also looking for any scratches on people's faces or their hands or bruises. Because these women had put up such a huge fight, there was a chance that whoever was attacking them had received some sort of injuries in the process. And interestingly, they actually stopped quite a few people. There were lots of cars that came through with multiple men in them. There were astonishingly lots of people that came through with lots of scratches on their faces and hands. And so they were questioning as many people as they possibly could through this method, while also trying to rule out sex offenders and speak to the staff and the lodge visitors. As if the suspect pool was not massive enough at this point, they also kind of zoned in on poachers. According to numerous articles around the week after the murder, authorities spoke about how they had been having a huge struggle with poachers throughout the Starved Rock Park all winter so far. And authorities wondered if maybe these women stumbled across some poachers and saw something they weren't supposed to and ended up being killed. And when you kind of broke everything down and looked at it, what do poachers typically have on them? They typically carry rope of some kind to tie up animals, to make their traps, and they also usually carry things like pickaxes. And pickaxes usually have wooden handles. And then there was a massive break in the case, the first huge bit of hope that they had so far this entire time. Those photographs had been developed, and it turned out there were 4 that the women had taken, and they had taken them the day they were believed to be murdered. And not just that, one of the photographs was of the women in front of the cave that their bodies would eventually be found in days later. One of the photographs was triple exposed, and in the background behind a tree appeared to be a lurking man. Now, Sheriff Utzi and Deputy Dummett were so convinced that they saw someone back there that they even released a description of this person. They said this was likely a 30-year-old man, about 6 feet tall, 160 pounds, and even said that you can clearly see this man has his arm to his side, and it looks like he has this, tree branch in his hand, what he would eventually use to go on and attack the women. They even went as far as speculating that the photograph was triple exposed because whichever woman was taking it at the time peered through the camera and saw this man lurking in the background. And out of panic, her finger just kind of lingered for a second, causing the picture to triple expose. Now, this was one of the very first out of many, many, many controversial things within this case, because while Sheriff Utsi and Deputy Dummett were so convinced that there was a person in this photograph, many other experts said, we have no idea what you're seeing. We absolutely can't see it. So they ended up sending this photograph in to be analyzed further at a Rochester lab, maybe blow it up, clear it up, to hopefully see if this was in fact a person, and maybe it would help them have some sort of description. And while they were waiting for these results to come back, the leads kept pouring in. It seems like every single article, there were numerous new suspects authorities were questioning. There were so many moving parts going on. And one very interesting person that I wanted to mention that authorities looked at is actually one that was kind of in passing, and then I just never saw anything about it again. One of the first articles and the first people mentioned was a stable hand. Now, this stable hand apparently worked at a stable, obviously, that was located near the entrance to the St. Louis Canyon. And this stable hand had been working the day that the women were murdered, around the time they were believed to be murdered. And I think they originally went to speak to this man to see if he had seen or heard anything strange, but ultimately they ended up getting a tip that he had actually been acting very bizarre that day after the murders were thought to have occurred. He apparently seemed incredibly nervous, his clothes were disheveled, so authorities are like, great. Is this guy potentially our suspect? So they went back to try to question him, and this man had vanished. Just dropped off the face of the earth. For the next week or so, you see multiple articles where authorities are making pleas to the public to help identify this man, to try to bring him forward and find him. But despite this odd information, all articles about him just stop. There is absolutely no conclusion that I can find to if this man was ever found again. Reports also were flowing in around this time about a peeping Tom that was in the area. There were multiple residents living around the park that described a burly blonde man in the days and weeks prior to the murder, just, casually looking in people's windows, staring at the women, staring at the children. But ultimately, it seems they never found a name or a face to match with the accusations. They also had zeroed in on a truck driver in the area that had similar twine found in the back of his car. Some truck driver that accidentally poisoned himself and was found unconscious in a nearby motel. There was another person that went AWOL from a mental institution. All of this, mind you, was happening within the first week or two after the crime occurred. That's absolutely bonkers. And on March 21st, while they were again still waiting for these photographs to come back, there was another huge lead that took authorities in a very promising direction. While I was researching this particular tip, I also came across some strange inconsistencies in the reportings about it. A car salesman from the LaSalle area reached out to authorities and claimed that he had been driving along Highway 178 around 2 p.m. the day of the murders, and he actually saw the women standing in the parking lot at the west entrance of Starved Rock Park. The first handful of articles about this tip then claim that this man saw a tan and beige Bel Air car back up to the women in the parking lot, and this 25-year-old young man stepped out. Now, the description of this man is that he was about 5'8", 165 pounds, had red curly hair, and he was wearing a yellow coat and blue pants of some kind, probably jeans or slacks, wasn't sure which. And this man apparently went up and had a conversation with the women, and he wasn't the only one in the car. According to the car salesman, there was a second male that remained in the vehicle the entire time as he was passing by. This is huge. This could be massive in terms of identifying someone that was potentially responsible. It's not every day that you come across curly redheads. That's just the fact of the matter. And so authorities were really banking on this one particular tip. But what's interesting is that in later reports that speak about this car salesman and the tip that he had brought forward, it states that he saw a gray 1959 Plymouth station wagon with a luggage rack on top. Now, at first, I was like, oh crap, did I get the first car wrong? And so I looked back and I was like, no, it's definitely, the Chevy Bel Air. And so then I was like, okay, well, did he just change his mind and say it was another car? But then I found that in the exact same articles, it also mentions looking for the tan and beige Chevy Bel Air. So I don't know if he just came up after the fact months later and said, oh, I also saw this car, or, maybe it was this instead of that. Regardless, it also was stated in these much later articles months later that this car salesman apparently passed back by the area at around 4 p.m. the day of the murders. And according to him, he saw this gray Plymouth station wagon parked near a creek in the area. So this was massive because authorities are thinking, okay, we've got this guy, he's seeing these cars here, they're there literally the perfect time frame of the murders, and the station wagon's by a creek, which means someone could have potentially been cleaning themselves off. And so for some reason, and I had not seen them do this up until this point, I don't know if it was just not stated that they had done this, it was the first time that I saw it, but they decided to give this car salesman a polygraph test, I guess, to check the validity of his tip. And when he ended up passing this polygraph test, they started blasting the information absolutely everywhere. Now, at this point, most of the evidence that had been sent to the lab, everyone was still waiting for it. And so now that they had a potential description of the perpetrator, they decided to bring in a Joliet psychiatrist to profile the killer. And essentially what this psychiatrist ended up saying was that this was a sex sadist. Now, all of the articles up to this point had already been describing the killer or killers as sex maniacs, but he was just kind of confirming this. The psychiatrist was making it seem like this was the act of one person, a lone wolf, a hermit, and even stated that there was a very high chance that this person would commit an act like this again. And with this growing fear of a sex maniac, sex sadist killer being out on the loose, and possibly more than one of them, understandably, all of the nearby towns were absolutely terrified, and they essentially just shut down. Usually, people didn't even lock their doors in LaSalle and the surrounding areas. But at this point, locks were flying off the shelves. There were reports that people were putting 2, 3, 4+ locks on their doors, terrified that someone was going to come in and do the same thing to their entire family. Local businesses were taking a hit as well. There were quite a few local taverns that usually remained pretty busy, especially on the weekends, but nobody was going out anymore. Or parents that would go and have like a date night out on the weekends couldn't even find a babysitter. People were refusing to babysit because they did not want to be alone in a stranger's house, responsible for their children, with this sex maniac out on the loose. There were interviews with husbands that said that they were leaving work early because they refused to get home to their spouses and their children after dark out of fear that something would happen to them. And even local patrols were ramped up. This is how scared this community was. There was a lot of pressure to solve this crime. People were scared, families were heartbroken, nobody felt safe, and on top of that, there was a very, very unfortunate power struggle and pissing contest that seemed to be going on. When you have a case this large, usually the more local law enforcements are not equipped, or they don't have access to the best resources possible to solve the case. When the state police arrived, thinking they would immediately start investigating the case, they were actually met with Harlan Warren and Sheriff Utsi, who had very clearly already taken things over, and Harlan Warren was already taking the evidence, putting it into his own office locked up, and was planning to send it to the state lab. A lot of people believe that the case should have even been handed over to the FBI. So you've got all these different departments that are kind of trying to have one hand into the case. And so in a situation like that, it can overcomplicate things like crazy. And on top of that, it was an election year. And specifically, State Attorney Harlan Warren was up for re-election. And so there were a lot of people that were angry, thinking that he wasn't handing over the case when he needed to because he was hoping he could solve it himself and that would get him votes. It just seemed like everyone wanted to be the one to solve the case. And unfortunately, all of that ended up kind of screwing a lot of things up. This is kind of the point where the case starts to slow down and go a bit downhill. So it was announced on March 24th by the state lab that the club that everyone had been so adamantly stating was the murder weapon was likely not the murder weapon. After examination, it was found to be so decayed that there was absolutely no way It could have dealt the over 100 blows to the women that it was thought they had, received, and maintain its integrity. And what's interesting about this is that this is only mentioned in like the itty bittiest article, like a paragraph of a random article, and never brought up again. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe it's because they felt defeated. But what's interesting is that this actually went on to be used in court as the murder weapon. So it's like, which one is it? And not only that, the lab in Rochester, New York that examined the photograph confirmed that this object that was initially believed to be a person, very apparently clearly standing there holding this log that was now proven to not be the murder weapon, was actually just a shadow and nothing more than that. And so some of the largest pieces of evidence they had so far been relying on seemed to just fly right out the window. But then reports were made on March 26th that again pushed towards this ever hopeful tip of this red-headed 25-year-old man. 2 women and a 12-year-old girl called into authorities because they had been walking through Matheson State Park on March 12th, 2 days prior to the murder. And Matheson State Park is directly beside Starved Rock. It's only a couple of miles away. And they claim that as they are meandering through the park, there's a man with a camera, and he was kind of like encouraging them to come with him. And after a while, they're like, you know what? We don't know this guy, and we're kind of getting the feeling that he's luring us deeper and deeper into the park. And so with this uneasy feeling, they bolted out of there. And the description of this man was a 5'8", 25-year-old man with red, curly, or wavy hair. When they heard this other tip that had come in, they decided to come forward with this information, and they were not the only ones. There was also another couple from LaSalle that had reached out with a similar story. They had been walking around and exploring Starved Rock State Park. They were actually in the French Canyon a few days prior to the murder when they too came face to face with this 25-year-old redheaded guy, and he seemed to be, pointing out ice formations and trying to converse with them. And according to this couple, they got a very, very uneasy feeling about him. So at this point, we have 6 people pointing out seemingly the exact same man acting strangely around the park just before the murders. So while authorities are now desperately trying to identify this man, thinking this was going to be it, they also started to push efforts towards searching the canyon a little bit more, because at this point, things had warmed up a tad and the snow was starting to melt. So the canyon went through another massive and intensive search. They actually had to dam the waterfall and then bring in gasoline-powered pumps to pump 15,000 gallons of water out of the pool that had been created now that things had melted at the bottom of the canyon. And so all of these searchers were scouring the bottom of St. Louis Canyon, while others were checking the nearby highways, privately owned farms in the area, mine pits that had been abandoned, you name it. They actually ended up finding something. They found a small red fiber on the ground outside of the cave. And keep in mind that apparently this entire time, this canyon had been roped off. No one was allowed inside of it. So this fiber was sent in for forensic testing, and it was found to be red Orlon fiber. And according to Harlan Warren, when the forensic examination was done of the women and their clothing and their bodies, they found numerous similar red fibers all over them. However, the women had not been wearing any red Orlon. So it indicated that this fiber came from the attacker during the struggle. Now, what's interesting is that this red Orlon fiber was actually a very recently developed synthetic fiber that was used as a replacement for wool, and it also was sometimes used in upholstery for vehicles. So they would be able to track things out from there. Authorities plan to visit every single store in the area that was selling anything similar, and hopefully it would lead them to a sale, and hopefully that sale would lead them to a person. And while that news in itself is already huge, the lab also announced during this time that they found bloody, smeared fingerprints on the women's clothing. Now, no one knows why on earth it had taken them so long to notice this, because at this point, the clothing had been with the lab for around a month. Regardless, these fingerprints were found on a hem of a slip one of the women had been wearing, a pair of stockings, and a girdle. And according to the lab, the placement of these fingerprints did not line up with them being put there by any of the women. women, meaning that these fingerprints could potentially belong to the attacker or attackers. So in a frantic dash for answers upon hearing this information, this was something solid that they had been waiting for this entire time, authorities announced that they were going to be mass fingerprinting. They planned on fingerprinting at least 500 people and hope to start comparisons once the prints taken off the clothes were fully analyzed and could be used. With this news, Nick Spiros, who was the owner of the Starved Rock Lodge, actually stepped up and volunteered himself and his son, George Spiros, to be the first ones printed. And they also were going to be offering up a sample of hair because authorities planned to take some of that from people as well. And they were hoping that this would encourage others to voluntarily give their hair and fingerprints as well. And not just that, Nick Spiros decided to donate $5,000 to the reward, leading to the arrest of whoever was responsible for murdering these women. So while authorities are tackling fingerprinting by the masses, another huge breakthrough ended up coming through on April 19th. Reports came back from the Rochester lab in regards to the hair found in the women's hands, the long-awaited results. 18 strands of hair had been taken from Miss Oding's hands. So this was like a full-on grab of someone's hair and pull it out kind of situation. And when they had been analyzed, they came to the conclusion that these hairs were coarse brown hairs, and they likely came from a middle-aged man. 8 strands of hairs had been taken off of the glove belonging to Miss Murphy, and these hairs were entirely different than the first set. These hairs were much finer, they were also blonde, and they were believed to come from a teenager. So we've got 2 different kinds of hair from 2 different victims, which really supports the idea this crime was committed by more than one person. While this was a massive step forward in the case, it also unfortunately brought forward a lingering issue in the case that had been apparently going on behind the scenes this entire time. So, as I had told you, state police had originally tried to take this case. And when they arrived, State Attorney Harlan Warren was like, nope, we've got it. The sheriff's department's got it. Don't worry about it. And they had actually urged Harlan Warren to not send evidence to the state lab. The state lab was apparently very understaffed with only 2 people working there, and they relied on very old equipment. So with cases like this, the state police said they would typically send any of the evidence that needed to be examined off to Chicago or to the FBI lab. They received better results, more timely results, there was advanced equipment, but apparently Harlan Warren refused this and sent everything to the state lab anyways. And then when the state lab came back with wonky results, he would then send all of the evidence to Rochester to be examined again. And so just after the announcement of these bloody fingerprints, and while things seemed to be going so well, all of a sudden there is just this rush of articles in regards to the case, pointing the finger at Harlan Warren for not handing the case over, and also to the state lab for, quote, bungling the case. A lot of people were upset that it took this lab a month to realize that there were bloody fingerprints, huge pieces of evidence on the women's clothing, and not just one piece of clothing that could potentially be missed, but 3 separate pieces of clothing. And we all make mistakes. There's human error. That's just the fact of the matter. It's the nature of who we are. But unfortunately, this was not the only circumstance like this. Another result the state lab had come forward with had almost entirely changed the motive and direction that this whole case went in. A couple of weeks into the investigation, when all of the evidence had kind of been separated and was being looked at and still analyzed, Mr. Oding was made aware of all of the different things found on Mrs. Oding's body, all of that. And it was noted by him that her wedding rings were missing and she never ever took them off. And so there were just dozens of articles talking about these missing wedding rings. Authorities started to announce that this could potentially have not been a motive of sexual assault, but instead robbery gone wrong. And so things almost went a totally different direction. And as all of this hubbub is being made about these missing rings and how that drastically changes the case, all of a sudden the state lab comes forward and is like, oh, whoopsie, we actually found them. Miss Oding's rings were tucked into her glove, in the finger of her ring finger, and somehow had been missed. So again, while there's absolutely human error, this is now the second thing. And not just this, they had also missed a handful of other personal items tucked in the women's pockets. But the cherry on top was the fact that this lab had also been the very first lab to analyze the hairs found in the hands of Miss Oding and Miss Murphy. And they said something completely different in their results than the Rochester lab did. The state lab said that the hair belonged to the same person. These two completely different colored, different textured hairs belonged to the same person, and it was a female. And so now everyone's like, great, okay, well, how do we trust any of the reports now, any of the evidence? How thorough is their investigation if they didn't even check the pockets of the women? They missed, for example, a whole pair of glasses in one of the women's pockets. And it also throws into question the fact that the state lab is also who had brought forward the fact that they did not believe this frozen tree limb was actually the murder weapon. The evidence, because of these first wonky results, had gone to new hands. So they were passing through multiple different places, which just adds to the possibility of contamination. And you can't have that in a triple homicide like this. And this was such a huge deal that the lab chief actually resigned over it. Like, he straight up quit, said, forget it. We're understaffed. We don't have any funding. Like, we did the best we could with what we have, but we basically don't have crap to work with. So at this point, things seemed to quiet down quite a bit. And as I was going through newspapers.com to look through all of the different articles, I was going month by month. And when you hit around this point, it goes from being like 5+ pages of results to like a handful per entire month. Not as much information being put there about the investigation. I don't know if that was by choice to kind of keep critique out of it. But the few articles that were out there, you could tell authorities were still working on the case. They were still questioning plenty of potential suspects in the crime, but it seemed that all of it was leading to a dead end. And on top of that, it also ended up being confirmed that the women had not been sexually assaulted. So their entire sex maniac motive that they had been following this entire time was very likely wrong. But apparently, behind the scenes, while everything was pretty quiet, police had been eyeing someone that so far had not made it to the news yet. It seems like my entire research process through this case, there was like the truck driver's question, the stable hand, names of people that were being questioned. Everyone that police were looking into majorly had been blasted in the media. But this person had not been in there a single time up until a Times article that was released on October 12th, 1960. And this particular article speaks about authorities re-questioning an employee at the lodge. And while he was not named in this article, we now know him as the 21-year-old dishwasher, Chester Weger, a married man with 2 young children. Now, when he had originally been questioned by authorities in regards to the crime, it was the day of or the day after the crime occurred. I've not been able to confirm either way. But when he was questioned, he maintained that he had an alibi. He was cooperative the entire time, very forthcoming it seemed. Chester told authorities that he had been in the powwow room of the lodge the day of the murders in that very specific time frame, apparently writing letters to another woman that was not his wife. And despite him claiming to get pencil and paper from the receptionist at the front desk and being in a very public space in this lodge and also saying that he plugged in the jukebox and was loudly playing music, not a single person could corroborate his alibi. And according to this article, the reason authorities questioned him to begin with was, first of all, obviously because he worked at the lodge. That was their first thing they wanted to do. He also had been working that day, but also they claimed that he had scratches all over his face just after the murders. And they said that they questioned him about it. And he said that he had cut himself shaving. So at this point, Chester is explaining everything away. They have no reason not to believe him. He actually took multiple polygraphs during this time and passed all of them. They brought him back at some point for another polygraph test, and he apparently failed it. Or at the very least, it was inconclusive. So this brought him back to the forefront with authorities. And not just that, over the past couple of months, information and evidence they had been gathering made them question if he was potentially the killer. Authorities had found in their search of the lodge a very similar string to the string that had been used to tie the women up in the canyon. And this string was found, according to some articles, in the tool shed. And there were also 2 other spools that were found in the kitchen. And when authorities were questioning Chester one of these times, he agreed that he typically kept string like that in his pockets for fishing. He also admitted he had access to the tool shed and the kitchen, and obviously spent a lot of time in both. And so when they furthered the questioning, they also asked Chester to provide them with the clothing that he had been wearing the day of the murders. And he brought them a buckskin jacket. And when authorities very briefly looked it over, they noticed spots that appeared to be blood on the sleeve of the jacket. So they sent it off to be tested by the lab. And to top it off, Chester Weger had, during this time, been positively identified as the lurker in the woods of the park 2 days prior to the murder that those 2 women claimed had been bothering them. And he had been previously convicted of sexual assault when he was only 14 years old. So he seemed like he was potentially the guy. So authorities put him on 24/7 surveillance, and a 60-year fight began.